Hello, welcome to the Oregon Golf Association's online high school rules seminar. I'm Craig Winter with the Oregon Golf Association, and we hope that you're able to sit down, get through some of these seminars, and have a little bit better understanding of the rules of golf as you play the game throughout the season, and certainly through the rest of your lives. This seminar is going to focus on quite a few different things, but it's not going to focus on everything. So if you have an interest in learning the rules quite a bit more, we do have one-day clinics and 3-day workshops that you're welcome to attend, and you can visit our website, oga.org, for additional details. The topics of this part of the presentation will focus, as all of our presentations will, on the definitions. You can find the definitions and actually the entire set of rules if you go to the USGA's website. If you don't have a rule book yourself, just go to usga.org in your browser, and there's a rules tab, and just click on rules and decisions. And the USGA does have the entire rule book online, and in addition the entire decisions book. But one section you're going to really want to focus on is the definitions. It's in section 2, and if you have a rule book with you right now, you can go to page 5 in your rule book and you'll see the beginning of that section. Definitions are all alphabetized, starting with abnormal ground conditions and going all the way through wrong putting green. There's 51 definitions, and this really is the foundation to you understanding the rules of golf. If you don't know these definitions, when you try to read a rule, the rules really don't make much sense. And one thing that you'll see throughout the entire rule book, if you take a look at a rule, or even in the definition section, when you see an italicized word, so a word is actually in italics, that means it's defined in the definition section. And some of the rules, for example, if we go to Rule 24, this is a great demonstration of how important it is to understand the definitions. If we go to 24.2, which deals with immovable obstructions, you'll know those as cart paths, buildings, sprinkler heads. All of these words in this phrase right here are all definitions. If you don't know what through the green means, you probably want to look that up in the definitions, and we'll get into that in this presentation. Hole is defined, nearest point of relief is defined, hazard is defined, putting green is defined. So all of these words have a definition in and of themselves. Some of them are many paragraphs long. So in order to understand the rules, before you start looking just at the rules for an answer, ensure that you understand what the definitions are. And again, I just stress throughout this entire presentation, all the teaching that we do is you get real comfortable with the definitions, because without a basis for what these words mean, you won't be able to understand what the rules themselves mean. So let's get back into the presentation. We'll also focus on the 2 primary principles to the rules of golf. These are the basics. This is really going to get you through a lot of different situations. When you're not totally sure about the rules, these principles will help you to better understand them. Now, they're not a replacement for the rules, but they can certainly help you go a long ways. What are the parts of the course? We're going to focus on that so you know where you are and where you've played from. We'll focus on Rule 13.2, which is dealing with the immediate area around you and where you want your ball to go, and specifically what you can and can't do to improve that area. 13.4, that's the rule that prohibits what you're allowed to do when your ball is in a hazard. Very, very important. A lot of penalty strokes. Officiated many years at the state championship, and that's where most of our penalties come from. Players not quite sure what they can do when their ball's in either a bunker or a water hazard. And then lastly, this presentation will touch on what happens when your ball is in play and it's at rest and it's moved, or what happens when your ball is in motion and it's deflected. That's Rules 18 and Rules 19. So why are you here? This is a brief introduction. The book that is on the screen right now, I'm going to read a brief passage that really talks about kind of the evolution of the rules of golf. I'm sure a lot of you, if you've looked at the rules or you've had much experience with the rules, or your coach has tried to teach you the rules, they seem really complicated. Well, there's a reason for that, unfortunately. It's because this game that you're playing is actually quite complicated. This tale is the genesis of golf. It's by a gentleman named Jeffrey Cousins, and it has Canobalin and it has Caractacus. Pardon the cartoon characters, they're just for demonstration. So I set the genesis of this great game in prehistoric Britain on the rolling Sussex Downs circa 200 BC. There, in one of several caves set in the hillside, lived an ancient Briton with sporting proclivities and a wife that did not understand him. One day, walking back from a hunting expedition and followed by his wife, Canobalin spotted a round pebble lying on the short-cropped turf. He gave the pebble a joyous clip with his knobbly flint-studded club and grinned as he watched it skim over the turf. On coming up to it, he delivered another shrewd blow with similar result. By this time, they were very near the cave, and a third stroke was made, whereupon the pebble, bounding along the grass and then hitting another pebble, jumped into the air and fell into a cauldron which had been left simmering on an oak wood fire. Canobalin stared for a moment, then collapsed to the ground, convulsed with mirth. He, very naturally, began talking about his exploit, and the next Saturday, Campfire dilated extensively on how he had holed out in the cauldron in just 3 strokes. One of his listeners was Caractacus, equally young, equally sporting. The sequel is obvious. Caractacus was up at dawn with his club and a pebble, and inside of a week he had made enough progress in the art to issue a challenge. The match was played from the top of the Ditchling Beacon to a cauldron sunk in the ground beneath their 2 caves. Canobalin struck first, right down the middle, and Caractacus followed with one equally good. Canobalin's next shot, however, was unlucky, for the pebble rolled into a gully, whereupon Caractacus was still on the pretty in 2. Canobalin surveyed the gully and scratched his head. Caractacus had a look and stroked his beard. "I don't see how I can get it out of there," said Canobalin. "It would be rather difficult," murmured Caractacus. "Perhaps I could pick out the pebble and place it on the grass," hazarded Canobalin. "Perhaps you couldn't," retorted Caractacus. "I'll give you one for doing so," offered Canobalin, but Caractacus had walked out of earshot. So Canobalin hacked away 4 times before getting clear of the gully, and Caractacus, despite duffing his third, holed out in 3 fewer strokes. But Canobalin refused to accept the result and appealed to the council of the campfire. That would be your coaches. The elders heard the evidence with becoming gravity, and after consulting amongst themselves for a time, left the chief to announce the decision. The chief said, "We are not well acquainted with these useful sports and pastimes, but, having considered the matter carefully, with due regard to what we feel is the strict justice of the case, we rule that the pebble must be played as it lies. Caractacus, therefore, is the winner." This is obviously Geoffrey Cousins' thought on how golf was created. 200 BC is probably a little bit predates when golf actually came about. The first rule of golf, play the ball as it lies. That's basically what these rules are based on. There's another principle that I want to talk about here, but before we go on, the rules are so complicated really because they have to be. The rules that you play under, the USGA rules of golf, those are the same rules that are used in Mexico, and then the R&A, the Royal and Ancient in Scotland, use the exact same rules throughout the rest of the world. Whether you play golf here in Oregon, whether you play golf in Pakistan, whether you play in Russia, in Australia, South America, the same rules of golf are used throughout the entire world, and golf courses in Oregon are not the same as golf courses throughout the rest of the world. So they need to be able to take all of these factors in before they can really address what goes on a golf course. So yes, they're complicated. Unfortunately, there's a reason for that, and really it just comes down to because they have to be. They have to be able to deal with every situation that could come about. The 2 great principles in golf, well, these were coined by a man named Richard S. Tufts back in the early 1960s. The first is play the course as you find it. It's really pretty basic, and we'll get into that when we get into Rule 13.2. I'll provide a little additional explanation in the next slide. His next principle, you put your ball into play at the start of the hole, play only your ball, and do not touch it until you lift it from the hole. This is a pretty basic concept, but I think most of us know when we play golf, sometimes we lose our ball. You probably all know that you can mark and lift your ball on the putting green. So that principle doesn't apply with respect to every rule, but it does apply most of the time you play golf. And you can kind of sum that up to play the ball as it lies. Okay? If you're not allowed to move it under the rules, which normally you aren't, you just play the ball wherever it comes to rest. So play the course as you find it. What exactly does that mean? I'm going to actually read a passage from Richard Tufts. We'll get into some rules and we'll get into some videos in a minute, but I can't say this any better myself, so I'm just going to read what Mr. Tufts says. If there is one principle more basic than any of the rest, it must be that you play the course as you find it. This simply means that the player must accept the conditions he encounters during play and may not alter them to suit his convenience. The object of this rule is obvious. One of the great features of golf is that it tests the player's ability to execute a great assortment of strokes under a perplexing variety of conditions. Golf would cease to be a game of skill if the player were permitted to get the best of the conditions which confront him through their elimination, rather than to overcome them by the expert execution of his stroke. Golf, like life, is full of breaks. It is a game of chance, one of its fascinations being in the way the ball bounces. To be able to accept the breaks and still go on playing your game has always been one of the tests of a true champion, a test which it is more important to meet successfully in golf than in any other sport. The acceptance of the conditions which the player finds on the course is therefore a vital part of the game. Playing the courses you find it, you find your ball and it's in deep rough. Well, you hit it there, you're going to have to find a way out. That's just the way that we play golf. Everybody has good lies in the rough. Sometimes you have a bad lie in the fairway. And that ties in really well to just a quick story I'll tell you about playing the balls at lies. Tom Watson had a caddy named Bruce Edwards, and Bruce recently passed. There was quite a bit of press, and you may have heard about some of that. But Bruce Edwards also caddied for another golfer I'm sure you're familiar with, Greg Norman. And that was prior to caddying for Tom. There's a great story that's told by Bruce Edwards, and he says, the biggest difference that I ever saw from Tom Watson and Greg Norman relates to sand-filled divots. Now, if any of you have ever ended up in a sand-filled divot, you may have thought, this is unfair. Why don't I get relief? Well, the answer really is pretty much because that's just the way the game is played. There's not a good reason to give you relief. There's not a good reason really not to give you relief, although the reasons not to are actually a little better than the reasons to. Bruce Edwards would relay a tale. Greg Norman hits a perfect drive right down the middle of the fairway. He finds his ball in a sand-filled divot. He looks at Bruce and he goes, "Why me?" And then he would transfer over. Now I'm caddying for Tom Watson. Tom hits a great drive right down the middle, gets up to it, ends up in a sand-filled divot. Tom, of course, with that great smile, grabs his club and he looks at Bruce and he goes, "Bruce, watch this." That's the attitude that you need to have when you play golf. Every shot that you make, even the best of shots, sometimes have bad lies. Sometimes you make a terrible shot and it bounces off a tree, and instead of going out of bounds, it bounces right back into the fairway. There's good lies, there's bad lies, but in golf we do play the ball as it lies. Now we're going to get into parts of the course. This is a overhead shot of Waverly Country Club here in Portland, Oregon. It is so important that when you make a stroke in golf, you understand where the ball was played from and you understand where the ball ends up. Hopefully, it ends up on the course. And the course, now that we're going to start getting into definitions here, the course is the whole area with any boundaries established by the committee. So this is the out-of-bounds marking at Waverly. Out-of-bounds can be marked in a lot of different ways. This is back behind the 18th green, and there's white stakes and a cement cart path. And then it gets to the road, and then it wraps around. It's a fence, white picket fence. Then it goes to a chain link fence. And it wraps most of the course in chain link, and then it goes back to white stakes around the maintenance area, and then back to chain link. Your ball is on the course if any of the ball is on the course. And one of the things that's very important to remember is that out of bounds has a verticality to it that goes up forever and down forever. The line on the ground or the stakes, those simply define where that curtain basically falls. I'll get into that a little bit more once we see more parts of the course. That verticality is very important to understand. The next part of the course we're going to look at is the teeing ground. The teeing ground is the starting place on every hole that you're playing. It's not a very big area. Okay, you take the tee markers. In this case, we're playing the yellow tee markers. The outside limits of those tee markers, you can measure back up to 2 club lengths in depth. And the outer limits of the tee markers define that boundary. Just like out of bounds, a ball is outside the teeing ground only when all of it lies outside the teeing ground. Similar to out of bounds, a ball is out of bounds only when all of it is out of bounds. So if you tee up with your ball partly in front of the tee markers, that's okay so long as some of your ball is within the teeing ground. And of course on the teeing ground, we can use a tee. The putting green is the next part of the course we'll look at. The putting green is all ground of the hole being played that is specifically prepared for putting or otherwise defined as such by the committee. That could be, for example, a temporary putting green. A ball is on the putting green when any part of it touches the putting green. So if your ball is on the fringe and it's overhanging the putting green but not physically touching it, your ball's not on the putting green. But if any part of your ball is touching the surface of the putting green, your ball is on the putting green and you'd be allowed to mark, lift, and clean it. The interesting thing, or very important thing to note about both the putting green and the teeing ground, it's specific to the hole that you're playing. So when we're playing, this is the 11th hole at Waverly, this is the teeing ground. And we're playing the putting green on the 11th hole. If we finish the 11th hole, then we go on to the 12th hole. And the 12th hole has the teeing ground and the putting green. As soon as we finish the 11th hole, this is no longer the putting green because we're not playing the 11th, we're now playing the 12th. So those two features, the teeing ground and the putting green, move throughout the course as you play throughout the course. Very important to remember that in the rules. What about water hazards? Waverly just has 2 water hazards. They're both red marked, which means they're a special type of water hazard, a lateral water hazard. We have the river, and then of course we have this other larger area, the pond. Water hazards are anything that has open water, okay, anything, whether or not they even have water. And all ground and water within the margin of a water hazard is part of the water hazard. So you could think of that as, this is a water hazard, and if there was a little island in here, okay, where your ball could stand, your ball could come out and it wouldn't be in the water, that would still be part of the water hazard because it's encircled by the margin of the water hazard. Water hazards, just like out of bounds, they have verticality, which means they go up and down. So the water hazard where I'm looking at right now goes up into the sky forever, directly up, and it goes down into the ground forever, directly down, just like with out of bounds. What about bunkers? A lot of bunkers on Waverly. We'll go ahead and fill those in. A bunker is a hazard consisting of a prepared area of ground, often a hollow, from which turf or soil has been removed and replaced with sand or the like. Now, if you've ever played golf in Hawaii or areas where there's heavy winds, sometimes they'll use crushed shell. That would be like sand. So bunkers are a little bit different than water hazards. They actually have margins that go down only. So here's a bunker near the middle of the screen. That bunker, the sand in the bunker and the dirt soil lip of the bunker is part of the bunker, and you go straight down into the ground. Okay, they don't go up. So if you're overhanging a bunker, like in this case, I think you can probably imagine that if your ball was stuck in this little tree right here, it would be above the bunker, but it's not in the bunker because it's not actually touching the sand in the bunker. Hazard. Now, it's not necessarily a separate part of the course, but it's important to know that when you see hazard in the rules, it includes both bunkers and water hazards. So all the brown on this page, these are all hazards, also known as a bunker, and these are also hazards, in this case known as a lateral water hazard. So what do we call everything else? This is a very important concept for you to understand. It's defined as through the green. Those 3 words, very important, through the green. It's the whole area of the course except the teeing ground and the putting green of the hole being played and all hazards on the course. So all the other space that we haven't already covered is through the green. That includes, if we go back to the first hole at Waverly, that includes the fairway. That includes all these trees. It includes the rough. It includes the fringe around the putting green. Once we get to the 11th hole over here, we have the teeing ground. We're playing the 11th hole, okay? The other tee markers are defining other teeing grounds for courses we aren't playing. Say there's red markers up here in front. Those aren't defining the teeing ground. Those are actually through the green. Because again, we only have the teeing ground of the hole that we're playing, which would mean the yellow tee markers. When we're playing the 11th hole, the 10th putting green is through the green, okay, because it's not the putting green, because we're not playing the 10th hole, we're playing the 11th. So hopefully you can understand a little bit more about that. I'm going to actually pull up a quick video that will show you a little bit better what I mean by that 3D or the verticality that some of those holes have. Let me pull this up real quick and be able to see that a little bit better. I think this is the one we want to watch. That helps represent the verticality that I was talking about of the margins. So we have water hazards that go up, and as this turns, you're going to see it also goes down. So here you see it has verticality up and down. Out of bounds is the same way. Bunkers only go down. Okay, they do not have verticality up. The putting green is a flat surface, it doesn't go up or down, and the teeing ground is also a flat surface, it does not go up or down. Everything that is not covered in this is through the green. So whether it's the space above the bunker, whether it's the space above a putting green, the space above or below the teeing ground, or even below the putting green, that's all through the green. Inside of this water hazard, you have that volume taken up, so you can't have a ball through the green inside of a water hazard. It's in the water hazard. You know, if you were to go in a pipe into the ground here and it goes underground and it's below a bunker, that ball would be on a part of the course under that bunker, so it'd be in the bunker. So hopefully that helps clarify what through the green means. It's a very important term to understand. Most of the time when you play golf, your ball is through the green. You hit from the teeing ground, you know, on a par 4, your ball is going to be hopefully through the green. You'll be in the fairway or the rough, or you know, somewhere outside of hazards and not on the putting green. But through the green, very important concept to understand. So let's go back to our presentation. And on the left, that is the definition for through the green. You've probably heard that on TV, you've probably seen it on rule sheets. Make sure you understand what that means, because it doesn't have anything really to do with the putting green. It's kind of everything else. So everything outside of hazards, and everything except the teeing ground and the putting green on the hole that you're playing. Now there are other conditions on the course that are also important to understand. Loose impediments, we'll cover those a little bit later, but those are the loose natural objects that are all over the golf course, whether they be leaves, sticks, twigs, worms, insects. Those are all loose impediments, and they can be in hazards, they can be on the putting green, they could be on the teeing ground, and most certainly they could be through the green. Obstructions come in two forms. Those artificial objects that are easy to move are movable obstructions. Those artificial objects that are difficult to move, like a cart path, would be an immovable obstruction. Those can be found on any part of the course. You might have a cart path that turns into a bridge that then turns back into a cart path, and where there's a bridge, that's in a water hazard. And then the cart path on each side is through the green. So that single immovable obstruction goes from through the green to in a water hazard back to through the green. So know where it is on the course and know what kind of condition you're dealing with. Abnormal ground conditions are really prevalent this time of year. You have casual water, you have ground under repair. Sometimes it's marked, sometimes it's not marked. Again, those are defined in the rules, so you can learn a little bit more about those by going to the definition section. And then also you have burrowing animal holes. All three of those types of things are all considered to be abnormal ground conditions. And we'll cover Rule 25, which covers abnormal ground conditions, in a future session. It's very important to understand the difference between a versus the in the rules. When you see something like a ball, it means you can use any ball you want, whether you found it on the course, whether you have it in your bag, whether you borrowed it from a fellow competitor. If you see the ball, it means you have to be very sure to use the ball that the rule is talking about. For example, go back to the cart pass situation. That rule, the obstruction rule, will say you must drop the ball, which means you have to drop the same ball that you played onto the cart path. A putting green means any putting green on the course. The putting green means the putting green on the hole that you're playing. And wrong putting green, a great example to show what this is referring to is on this image, if I was to hit my tee shot on number 11, and I hit a pretty bad shot and it hit the tree here and it bounced over onto the 10th putting green, that's a wrong putting green. And there's a rule 25-3 that specifically covers what is required of me, which is going to tell me I have to take relief, and it will lay out the procedure. All right, let's move on to an actual rule of golf. 13.2. Improving lie, area of intended stance, or swing, or line of play. This rule is vitally important for you to understand, but is also fairly long and can get kind of confusing, so you might need to read through this one a couple times. A player must not improve or allow to be improved, and we'll see a demonstration of what is allowing to be improved. These are areas that we're concerned about. You cannot improve or allow to be improved the position or lie of the ball. So this player is stepping down grass behind and it's improving the lie. The area of his intended stance or swing. So this would be an example of this player is allowing the caddy or another player to improve the area of an intended swing. That's not okay. The line of play or a reasonable extension of that line beyond the hole. So let me lay out what's going on here. This ball is this player's ball, or it could be another player's ball, and the line of play is where you want your ball to go, where you wish it to go, and a reasonable extension on either side. So that's why we see this kind of pyramid or branched out. The line of play is right down the middle of this, and it's reasonable to assume that the player might not hit it exactly on that line. So that's why we have a little bit more width to that line of play. This area is on that line of play and it is being improved. Whether it's the player or whether the player is allowing it, that's not okay to do. The line of play comes from the ground, so it's basically runs along the base of this bunker, and then it runs up the bank, and then it would be on the putting green up here, and it goes up forever. So not only can you not improve the ground or allow it to be improved, but you also can't improve things like tree branches and things like that if they're on your line of play. And finally, the area in which you're to drop or place a ball. Now, many of you have probably heard from your coach that you can move leaves out of the way where you're going to drop a ball. These are only areas that we're concerned about. Okay, moving leaves is okay to do where you're going to drop a ball. The areas that we're concerned about: the lie of the ball, the area of your intended stance or swing, your line of play, and a reasonable extension beyond that line or beyond the hole, and the area we're going to drop a ball. We're about to find out in the next part what you can't do in those areas. This rule is very specific. You're not allowed to press a club on the ground if it improves the lie of your ball. You're not allowed to move, bend, or break anything growing or fixed, including immovable obstructions like a fence on the course next to a cart path. You can't move that fence because that would be considered an immovable obstruction, and all objects defining out of bounds. This out of bounds stake is not an immovable obstruction. It's something that's called, it's a fixed object, it defines out of bounds, and this rule says you cannot move, bend, or break it. Again, remember, this rule is only worried about the areas that we saw at the beginning, specifically if this will improve, pulling that out of bounds stake would improve the lie, the area of the intended stance or swing, the line of play, or where you're going to drop a ball, then it would be a problem. If your ball is 40 yards away from this stake, and this stake is not on your line of play, and you walk over and you pull it out of the ground, the rules are not going to penalize you for that because it didn't improve anything that 13.2 cares about. You're not allowed to create or eliminate irregularities of the surface. So this player has a ball on the fringe. The line of play towards the hole looks like it might break a little bit left, so it's going to kind of go around. Well, we have a reasonable extension on either side, and this irregularity of the surface cannot be eliminated by replacing this divot. Okay, this in itself is a loose impediment, so if it was found over here and picked up, that's okay. We'll learn that when we get to Rule 23, but what you can't do with that loose impediment is eliminate the divot hole where it came from, if that happens to be on your line of play, stance, swing, or the lie of your ball. You're not allowed to remove or press down sand, loose soil, replace divots, or other cut turf placed into position. This could be like a ball mark, okay? Ball mark on the fringe the ball spins back, and the player walks up and steps it down. That's eliminating an irregularity. It's also pressing down a replaced divot. Okay, that's not okay if it happens to be on your line of play, the stance, swing, or it improves your lie. And lastly, you're not allowed to remove dew, frost, or water in any of those areas if it happens to improve those areas. This rule can get a little bit more complicated because there are things a player can do where there's actually no penalty. For example, in grounding of the club lightly when addressing the ball. Here's that dreaded sand-filled divot. If this player grounds the club lightly when addressing the ball, that may actually improve the lie of the ball, but because this rule says there's no penalty incurred, it's okay. Now if the player doesn't ground the club lightly and presses down and improves, that would be a problem. Here's a quick video that we'll look at that will have a demonstration of exactly what we're talking about. Now notice there's a ball right here. See how much you can see of it? Watch what's about to happen here. Okay, so that's not grounding the club lightly. That's pressing a club down. It improved the lie. That would be a penalty under this rule, specifically a two-stroke penalty in stroke play or loss of hole in match play. In fairly taking his stance, there's no penalty if you're moving, bending, or breaking something defining out of bounds if you're doing it in fairly taking your stance. Let's look at another video. This is an example of fairly taking your stance. For those of you that want to read a fairly lengthy decision, exactly what this means, you can go to 13-2/1. Now if you have your decisions book, some of you might have that, you can go right to it in your decisions book, or if you're using the USGA site, you would go to Rule 13, playing the ball as it lies. That's what we're looking at right now. You let that page load, and then you want to go to the far bottom right side, and you'll see the decisions. So 13-2-1, explanation of fairly taking his stance. You won't find this in your rule book. You'll find this in the decisions book, which is a much thicker book. Your coach probably has one, or you can find it online. And this is just a question and answer of what it means to fairly take your stance. There's a very important phrase in here that I'm going to talk about over the next couple videos. It means you're finding the least intrusive course of action, which results in the minimal improvement of the position or lie of the ball, area of intended stance or swing or line of play. That's very important to remember. It's the least intrusive course of action. So let's look at another video here, which will actually have an example of not finding the least intrusive course of action, which would result in a penalty, and then another player finding the least intrusive course of action and there's no penalty. So there's two players here. This first one, what the player's doing right now would actually be okay. If he played a stroke like that, that'd be okay in the rules. Hopefully you can see here that he is clearly not taking the least intrusive course of action. He's moving the tree a lot more than he needs to. He's actually going to tuck that little branch in behind the tree as well, and he's going to play pretty much an uninhibited shot. Okay, that would be a two-stroke penalty in stroke play or a loss of hole in match play because he didn't find the least intrusive course of action. And that basically means he didn't fairly take his stance. Now this is another video with Jim Furyk and PGA Tour Rules official Mike Shea. Jim is working with Mike to try to figure out how he can play this ball without incurring a penalty. Now the rules let you play in any direction you want. So Jim says he wants to play it directly out this way. Well, Mike is going to work with him to figure out where he's going to move that branch the least. Clearly it's going to interfere. If he went at it from the right side where he was previously, that would have moved the branch 6-8 inches in order for him to take his stance. If he goes at it from the left side, he moves it less, which means by definition that's the least intrusive course, and he's fairly taking his stance. So there's no penalty. Turns out that he actually has a pretty good swing here, and he plays his shot out of trouble back near the fairway. Hopefully that makes a lot of sense. You might want to rewatch that one just so you can see the difference, because it is very important. This comes up a lot in high school matches. It's not simply because you touched trees, any of that kind of stuff. This is about fairly taking your stance, so it has to involve the physical act of taking your stance. And again, you can play in any direction you want. So this player is fairly taking his stance because there's no other way he could have taken his stance to play the ball in the direction he chooses, where he would have bent that out of bounds post less. Another tricky one, there's no penalty if you improve those areas in making a stroke, which means the forward movement of the club towards the ball. So if this player is actually on the way down towards the ball, he's making a stroke, but the stroke doesn't start till you start moving towards the ball. The backward movement of his club for a stroke, and the stroke is made, the backward movement is not actually the stroke. So when you're taking your backswing, you're not taking a stroke yet. Once you start the forward movement, that's when you start your stroke. This is important to remember, because if you are starting the backward movement of your club, you're in your backswing, and let's say there's a pine cone that affects the area of your swing, and knocking that pine cone off will actually improve the area of your swing. You can't just knock that pine cone off in a practice swing. You can't reach over and pull it off the tree just by doing it with your hand. But if you do it while making the backward movement of your club for a stroke and you complete the stroke, there is no penalty. Okay? That's an important one to remember. In creating or eliminating irregularities of the surface within the teeing ground, or in removing dew, frost, or water from the teeing ground. And this really just comes from the history of the rules of golf. This is a close-up of Laura Davies. She typically takes an iron and she'll slam it into the ground a couple times before she tees off from the teeing ground. She's not using a tee. What she's doing is she's creating an irregularity of the surface. This is only okay on the teeing ground. You know, back when golf was first started, when the rules first came about, back in the late 1700s, players would actually reach into a hole and pull sand out and create a sand tee. Obviously, most of you use wood or plastic or something of the sort. You don't use sand anymore, but just to pay respect to history of the game, this is still okay only on the teeing ground. And then as well, we can remove dew, frost, or water only on the teeing ground. So we see the tee markers here. This is not a putting green. Those are the tee markers, and it goes back 2 club lengths in depth, so it would be okay in this area. And then on the putting green, you're allowed to remove sand and loose soil. So this ball's on the fringe, and here's the edge of the putting green. So this player would be removing sand and loose soil actually on the putting green, and you can do that, as you can see here, with anything you want, whether it be a hat, your hand, a club, your glove, a towel, whatever it would be, you're allowed to do that. The only thing you need to be cautious of is you don't actually press anything down. And then repairing damage is also listed here. The only type of damage you can repair on a putting green would be old hole plugs. So when a hole is moved from one location to the next, there's that round plug that's left. You can repair that anytime that it's on the putting green. And you can also repair ball marks. Whether you made it, whether it's an old ball mark, whether it's been there a while, as long as that ball mark is on the putting green, you can repair it. And again, it doesn't matter where your ball is, it matters where that ball mark would be. So this is Paula Creamer repairing a ball mark. There is an exception when a ball is in a hazard. This is a picture of Dustin Johnson. Many of you probably saw that in the PGA last year. He was in a hazard, so were there additional restrictions, specifically he was in a bunker, there was additional restrictions he needed to be aware of, and that's covered in Rule 13-4. Okay, so that's the first part of this. 13.4, we're actually going to take a quick break. You'll need to go to part 2 of this in order to watch the rules as they relate to 13.4 and rules 18 and 19, ball at rest moved and ball at rest deflected.